My name is Raphael Bostic. I'm a professor here in the Price School of Public Policy, and I run the Bedrosian Center for Governance in the Public Enterprise. And it's a center that's really focused on ideas of how do you improve the implementation of policy to make policy work better. And that involves thinking about institutions, the capacity of them, their relationships and their authorities, as well as the personal relationships that play out in terms of politics and the political policy-making process. An important part of that is leadership, and so we try to periodically get leaders to come on campus and give us some insights as to how they've been able to do the things that they do. And today we are very excited to have a representative of Congress, Karen Bass, here to speak with us, so we're very delighted to have you here. So as I said, we're not going to make this a speechifying afternoon, but I think it would be helpful for us all to get some sense of how you came to where you are. So what led you to want to run for Congress? Being a public official is not always sweetness and light. Sort of how did you come to do this, and how has it been so far?
I want to stand up so I can see you. I will try to be brief with this. I actually never had any intention of being in Congress or being an elected official for that matter. But I think it was how I grew up. So I've been involved in politics really since I was in middle school. And I think that was because of the time period in which I was growing up, the 60s and 70s, and the whole world was changing, and I wanted to be a part of that. But I was always focused on very specific issues, whether it was fighting against police abuse or trying to end apartheid in South Africa, or child welfare issues, or trying to deal with the whole over-incarceration thing that I knew was going to happen in the 80s when drug sentencing kind of went crazy. All of that I was involved in, and I actually had a nice little cush job at the other USC, the USC across town at the medical school. I was on the faculty there for a number of years and became really obsessed behind the whole crack cocaine epidemic. So I wound up starting a social justice nonprofit 23 years ago, which is still going strong, right down the street on Vermont and 81st. And from there, we were focused on very specific issues, and it had me interact with elected officials. And then because of term limits, I got pushed to run. And one thing that I think is very common with women is that women who run for office typically have to be pushed and persuaded and are tricked, like I was the first time. So I ran for the State House, and the State House has very strict term limits, so I could only stay 6 years. And when I was in my 5th year, the sitting congresswoman decided that she was retiring and I was taking her place. And because of the president winning and all, I became, very interested in going to DC. So I'm there. I'm in my 3rd year, and I have a very, very specific agenda, which I'm sure we will get to. So that's the short.
Thank you. Quick question: why was the State House decision going to Sacramento just a term limits issue, or did you think that there was things that you could do at the state level that?
Well, when the same congresswoman told me that there were no African-American women in the state legislature, and that I had been in the community long enough and I needed to go to Sacramento, I'm like, what do I want to go there for? So I went up there and I talked to some of my friends that were in office and said, why would anybody bother coming up here? And the issues that I had been working on in the community, which were child welfare and criminal justice reform and all of that, I realized, well, hey, I could go up there and do the same thing. So that's why I ran. And one of the things I've had the most fun with in being in office is applying grassroots community-based strategies in a legislative context. And that's been great fun, because you're not supposed to do that. It's not expected of you. It's very disruptive and consequently a lot of fun.
Very good. So with that, I think we should just start with questions. So if people have questions, raise your hand and we'll take them. So we have one back here. Yeah, I think you do.
Stand? Yes. Boy, I wasn't expecting all of this. Okay, my question is, and I appreciate you coming out today. What frustrations did you find in the state assembly that you are finding in the Congress that you can share with us?
Oh, I can share it. Well, let's see, what frustrations did I feel? You know, one frustration in running for office is you have to do a lot of fundraising, which I was used to because I was running an organization. But I was used to raising money for an issue and for an organization. It was difficult for me to make the transition to say I and give me money. But I had no problem when it came to issues. So that was, you know, a difficulty. The frustration I felt in Sacramento is I kind of had bad luck because wherever I've gone, everything's fallen apart. I mean, I went up to Sacramento when we were in a boom, and right after I got there, the economy collapsed. And then I wound up serving as Speaker of the legislature, which put me in charge of everything. So then I also had to do very, very painful things. You know, I had to cut things that I believed in. I had to do the opposite of what I believed in doing because the state was falling apart. So that was very difficult. And then everything is fine in Washington, then I go to Washington and Washington falls apart. I mean, you know what jinx. You know, the Tea Party took over, unfortunately, the Republican Party. And so I've had to deal with that, and that's been tough. And I actually, you know, when I actually work very well in a bipartisan manner. The issues I work on is very bipartisan. So I always feel bad for my Republican colleagues because I think a lot of times they want to do things differently, but I don't think they have a lot of choice because the minute they even think about doing things differently, they get attacked. And there's not an equivalent on the Democratic side. We don't get attacked.
So can I ask you about your speakership?
Yes.
When you became speaker, did you have strategies for running the assembly?
Yes.
And how did you go about figuring out what those strategies should be?
Yes.
And what things did you do to make sure that the place worked?
Yes, I absolutely had strategies about running the place because when I first went in, I went in as majority whip, what a whip does is the whip is responsible for collecting votes. And so I have found now I'm in my 9th year of being in elected office, everything I did on 81st and Vermont completely applies to the legislative context. So because I was used to being a community organizer, to me being a whip was the same thing as organizing. And I had very strong opinions about how the House should be run. And I felt it should be run in much more of a collective fashion. So for example, when we had to make horrible decisions to like cut education, cut healthcare and all of that because the state was running out of money, you know, I brought a team together to make those decisions, and we all kind of were vested in it, as opposed to the legislature on the state level is it's a complete dictatorship. The speaker controls absolutely everything, including where you park your car. And so you can use that in a punitive fashion, or you can use that in a collaborative fashion. And when you're speaker, you're also speaker for the Democrats and the Republicans. So I would help my Republican colleagues. They did legislation that I thought was bad, and I obviously wouldn't allow that to happen. But I looked for ways to be, you know, supportive of everybody.
I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit about what you think women in Congress or in the state assembly and the state senate can bring to the table that may be different from their male colleagues, and how that can work together to really help the process.
Being a female speaker was fascinating. One thing I've always liked about being female in this role is that you're always underestimated, and so you can use that to your advantage. But what I find is that you know, not to overgeneralize, but I think there's a little more collaboration and a little less competition. And so one of the reasons I looked forward to being in that role was I wanted to test it out, frankly, and to see whether or not it would work. But it is an extremely male world, both in the state and in Sacramento. So gender dynamics, interesting, in Sacramento, it was all about gender. In Washington, it's about gender and race. But race was not an issue in Sacramento, because we should be proud, but our state legislature is very diverse. But I do think, and I think what you saw of the women senators was that piece, was the collaboration, you know, piece.
Can I just follow up really quick? Is there any effort, because I know they do informal luncheons in the Senate, and obviously there are a lot fewer female senators than there are House members, but is there an effort to kind of formalize that process to really get those talks going. I know the senators, at least the ones that are reported, they have each other over at their houses and just do some.
Well, you know, that part is a little frustrating. That's different about the State House versus Washington. Washington is so big that, first of all, senators, I never see them. I mean, I was on the Senate floor for the first time last week watching Cory Booker get sworn in, and also one of our members was up for a confirmation, and we wanted to be witness to see what the Senate was going to do. They didn't confirm it. But we never interact. The Senate and the House never interacts. I'm not sure what the women senators are doing, but over in the House, because it's so big and so spread out, it is real. It's a lot harder to bring people together. So I'm kind of struggling with how to do that now. It's a lot easier in the State House.
Yes, thank you again for coming. You mentioned earlier on that you're trying to use grassroots initiatives
Yes.
at the legislative levels, and I find this a very interesting approach. And was also wondering, does it also go the other direction? And could you talk a little bit about how it's been working?
What's the other direction? What do you mean?
Trying to apply the legislative levels and issues at the grassroots levels,
yeah.
perhaps. Can you maybe talk about some of the?
Sure, I'll give you some specific examples.
Great, thank you.
What I did when I got to Sacramento, I wanted to work on child welfare, which is one of the key issues. Two big issues I work on in DC is one is child welfare and the other is Africa, because I'm involved in foreign policy now. And so when I was in the State House, I wanted to work on child welfare, and I wanted to come up with an agenda, a policy agenda around child welfare. So what I did, and this is a grassroots organizing strategy, one of the fundamental beliefs in grassroots organizing is you go to the people who are the most affected and you ask them what the solution is, okay? So I organized meetings all up and down the state with kids, with social workers, with parents, with administrators, with everybody I could think of, and asked them what they wanted to see happen in the child welfare system. I came up with about 25 areas of public policy, and then what I did was I submitted those all to the legal department, and they all came back in the form of bills, but I didn't put my name on any of the bills. What I did was then I sought out members of the House who had interest in the different categories. They were education, healthcare, but all related to child welfare. And then I did something that's very unusual for an elected official, was I gave the ideas away. I didn't want 25 bills, but if I could get a whole bunch of members of the House all doing child welfare, then it wouldn't be about me, it would be about the issue, and I would get a lot of people invested in it. And so elected office can be, and is more than not, a very individualistic thing. And I think that's wrong. I don't think it should be, not if you're really invested in changing policy. So that was one strategy that was taken. Another strategy, or another thing that I did was, we found out in the child welfare arena that people really looked down on the grandmothers and aunts and uncles that were taking care of the kids. And they would make statements like, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and all that. And so what we did then was I called this, I formed this select committee, and I called for a committee meeting. I don't know why I wasn't doing that. But anyway, so in the committee, what I did was, then we had 200 grandmothers go up to Sacramento and tell their stories. And there wasn't a dry eye in the room because my colleagues were not educated. You know what I mean? And so rather than have a bunch of experts cite a bunch of statistics, I wanted to grab them emotionally, which is also an organizing tactic, and get them to understand the plight of these folks from real experts, because they were the ones dealing with it. And we were able to, I didn't hear that apple far from the tree again. And people understood the need to put resources for grandmothers.
So if I could follow up on that, because I'm one of the expert types. Is there a role for that stuff, or should we all just go home?
You have to have all of the above. You absolutely have to have it. But at the end of the day, legislation is about votes. And what gets people to vote? Emotion, money, facts. I think all of those things are a part of the picture. But I do think when you're just giving, because a lot of people in policy, and no offense, but I mean, a lot of times people who are experts, and especially in an academic environment, think that it's the best research. And the best research is really, really important. But that research has to be, that life has to be breathed into it. You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. You know, I complain about my colleagues all the time. And that I feel like there's a lot that they know that they haven't grounded into real life, and they don't become the compelling story that makes our knowledge rich and captures people. And a lot of times you need to get other people to be willing to talk your issue for you, to have advocates, and the only way that happens is if they feel it themselves. And,
Absolutely.
you know, I like data tables, but you need these stories to make that happen.
And let me just give you an example of my life. Okay, so as a member of Congress, my life is scheduled sometimes in 15 to 30-minute intervals. And I can go in back-to-back meetings on all kinds of subject matters from the time I go to work until the time I go home, which sometimes might be rather late. If you think that I pay attention to all of that, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, when people come up and they want to talk to me about farming, I'm from LA, food comes from the grocery store. I mean, you know what I mean? So if you're going to come and present me data about farming and you think that I'm going to actually digest that and that's going to translate into policy, that's why it has to function on all these different levels. You know what I mean? And so, but if somebody brought me a farmer and they're telling me about their direct experience, then I'm going to remember that versus, you know, I need the data. I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to dismiss that. But you want to grab someone's attention that is a policymaker. And so to grab someone's attention, that's when you need the organizing. That's why people protest. And I was really used to that. That's what I had always done. So, so I kind of, you know, knew both sides of it. But that's why those strategies and tactics are also important as well.
Kind of a follow-up question to this is also going the other way, because you bring in the stakeholders and get the policy passed, but then trying to get that policy translated onto the local levels.
Right.
How does that implementation work?
Well, you know, part of my basic values is a real lifetime commitment to social and economic justice. And so you get a law passed, and then you go home and think it's done. Well, the minute you get the law passed, you have to fight for implementation, which is organizing. You got to get people to know the law passed. So we did a law recently around child welfare that provided acts for social workers to access the educational records of kids, which you would think that's kind of a no-brainer, but there was a privacy thing that was inhibiting that. Well, if nobody knows that law was passed, then how do social workers know that they have access to it? So it's part of my responsibility to let people know that. But the way I think the best policy is done is if you have a mass constituency outside, so that I can send an email that goes, especially with today's technology, that goes far and wide, so that masses of people know that this law passed. It's not a matter of a press release. So part of the strategy that we're using now in DC is now to try to organize a national movement around child welfare. So we've created a national organization called the National Foster Youth Institute that hopefully will play that outside voice. Because, you know, you want to let people know. So our goal is to have a child welfare leader in each congressional district. That's 435 congressional districts that we need to have somebody in, so that if something passes or needs to happen, it can feed directly back to us.
So that's really policy and community organizing.
Yes.
To get deep into an institution. You talked about the schedule. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about how you manage that. So you might have in the course of the day, 30 meetings, 15, 20 to 30 meetings.
And hearings in the middle. So I could be in the middle of a hearing, and I have to leave the hearing for 15, 20-minute meetings, and then go back into the hearing.
So how do you manage that? How do you stay sane? How do you establish what the important pieces of information that are being told are? What's the process that you use to manage that?
Well, I think one thing that's real critical about going in the office is that you've got to have an agenda. Because if you don't have an agenda, then the whirlwind takes control of you. You know what I mean? Because all of these issues come and hit you, and then how do you know which ones to focus on? I have an agenda. I have what I am doing to move me forward. but I also rely on my colleagues. And then, you know, it is a partisan environment, and I'm a partisan. You know, obviously I'm a Democrat. So I do rely on the Democratic caucus for guidance as well, because there's no way in the world I can digest all those issues. But I also have staff that are absolutely key, who are the experts. So Jenny Wood is here somewhere. Really. Yeah. Jenny is the expert in my office on just about everything, but specifically also child welfare. So you do have, but on the national level, you have really kind of a small staff. So you do try to have subject expertise, but we also rely, you know, very much on interns. So I'll do a little commercial and say anybody wants to come to DCP. There's lots of internship programs, and we really rely on interns to help us a lot. And there's substantive internship programs, not people that are stuffing envelopes, which everybody participates in. But you understand that.
Just on the internship issue, for those of you in 373, one of the students from last year was an intern. She came to my office 2 weeks ago and said that she stuffed envelopes for like 2 weeks and then started being a speechwriter for the member and being able to introduce sort of the ideas and be analytical and substantively so. So take that seriously. It is a real opportunity that people should take to heart. Other questions? Don't be bad.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I was wondering if you could tell us more about the foreign policy issues that you're
Sure.
working on.
Sure. I had mentioned that back in the 70s and 80s I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and really my first love was foreign policy. But I thought that the domestic issues were way too important for me. So I stopped working on foreign policy for a number of years, and now I'm very excited to be back into it. And I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm the lead Democrat on Africa-related issues for the Democrats. And my focus on Africa is actually on trade. And I'm trying very hard to change our perception of Africa, because, you know, it's sad that in our country we're not very smart, or not very knowledgeable, I shouldn't say smart, when it comes to the rest of the world. So I joke and say that people in the United States think Africa is a country the size of Texas. And Africa, you can take the entire 48 states and fit it on the continent 3 times, and it's 54 countries, and a billion people, and 7 out of 10 of the world's fastest growing economies are happening on the continent. So trying to change the image, because our image of Africa, aside from being very distorted about the size, we also think that Africa is one war or one famine after another. It's very analogous to me of inner cities. So we think inner cities are just about gangs and drugs. Well, Africa has 54 countries, most of them we couldn't even name, and a lot of them are doing okay. You know, it is still a poor continent, but I'm actually trying to do something that I never would have imagined in a million years I'd be doing, which is to promote U.S. business involvement on the continent of Africa. So that's my overall focus. But sitting on foreign affairs, I have to deal with the entire world. So I mentioned all the national issues I have to deal with. I also have to pay attention to what's happening in the globe. So if it's Syria or the Middle East or Asia, I have to be aware of what's happening around the world. I love that. I mean, you know, I love the fact that I have to know about so many issues, which means I'm also a complete news junkie. But I wake up in the morning, it's the first thing I do, is watch multiple news stations, read multiple papers, and then I go to work. I can't function in my day unless I've done all that prep before I've gone into the office.
How do you promote business in Africa?
Well, a lot of it is the education that we need to do in our own country, but there's some great examples. I mean, General Electric is actually a tremendous example of working in Africa in a very, in a way that's not a colonial way in the past of just extracting the resources. So I am working very specifically on a piece of legislation. It's our trade policy with the continent of Africa. We have a current trade policy. It's called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and it's expiring in 2015. Well, when it was first formed, the continent was in an entirely different position. So now it needs to be reauthorized and updated. So that's the specific work I'm doing, is working on that trade bill. But along with working on the trade bill, I do like policy breakfasts and all kinds of things to bring corporations, small businesses. There's thousands of Africans that live in the United States who are now beginning to go home because the things are much better on, the countries that they come from. And so promoting the diaspora, promoting African American businesses, as well as promoting businesses in general to participate in trade in Africa. Everybody understands that about Asia, but Africa is the new Asia.
Do you have mentors?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I'm a big believer in mentors. I have always recruited mentors, and I've often tackled stuff that I had no idea what to do. And so I go in and find mentors. So as soon as I got to Congress, I identified the members of Congress who've been there a long time and who had expertise, because no idea is new, as much as you might think it is. And it's all been tried before. And so I went and sought out the mentors on those issues and went and asked them to be my mentors. And one of the things I've always found in life is that people are happy to do that. And people are happy to be asked about what they did before and how they did it. So one mentor that I recruited, Charlie Rangel from New York, and then another one, actually the reason why I'm here today, I was supposed to be in Liberia, but I'm here because Ed Royce, who's a Republican, who's also a mentor, wanted me to, there was a hearing or something that I was supposed to go to. But anyway, so, going and asking people to help you, people are very, very open to that. In the time I've been in Congress, which is, I'm in my 3rd year, I think I've been to over 30 countries. I've been to 11 countries on the continent of Africa.
So you just went up and said, will you be my mentor?
Well, it was so funny because, and they didn't know what to do with me when I went up and I wanted to take them out to breakfast or lunch, and they're like, are you going asking me breakfast or lunch? I pursued them enough that they,
You wore them down.
I did work down. Now I knew them before because when I was speaker, I had to go to DC a lot. And so some of them knew what I had done, and they also didn't know how I was going to act. Since I had played that role in Sacramento, was I going to come in and act like I was all that in a bag of chips? So they didn't know. So once we got past that, and then when I told them what I was doing and why I was doing it, and now they're used to it. So I chase after them all the time. Okay, I want to do this. So we wanted to reauthorize the part of the trade bill last year, and I really had no idea how to do that. So I went to Mr. Rangel and Mr. Royce, Republican from Orange County, and I went to Rangel first. I didn't know Royce, and I asked him to help me, and he was like, okay. So he's sitting on the floor of the House, and before I know it, he starts calling over all these guys, because they're all guys, calling them all over. And I'm surrounded by all these guys who've been there for a long time, and he starts barking out orders and going, well, she wants to do this, and she's new, and she's really sincere, so I want you to help her do this, and I want you to help her do that. And he's giving everybody orders, and I'm furiously taking notes. And I followed up, and every day I report in and say, this is what I did, now what should I do next? And they walked me through it, and it was all good. It's just very important to be humble, and even if you do know a lot, there's always people that know more than you.
I'm currently interning at Community Coalition.
Oh.
I'm learning about the startup and the process of that. Can you talk a little bit about the frustrations or how you actually went from this idea to this now great organization that is still running?
Well, thanks, because I had no idea what I was doing. I really didn't even know what an executive director was. But what happened was I was just really obsessed behind the whole crack and gang situation. And I knew that the laws that were being passed were going to lead to all these millions of people being incarcerated. So I wanted to figure out what to do to stop it. And so I put this conference on to see whether or not other people thought like me, or if it was just me or what. And somebody came up to me and said there was this grant program that the federal government had. Well, at the time I was on the faculty at SC, and I didn't believe that anybody would give a grant just to me. So we actually put it under SC. And then when it got funded, I went, oh crap, now what do I do? And so what I did was I went out and found mentors that had been executive directors. I signed up for seminars, and I was real fortunate in starting the organization because we were housed, we were a USC project for 5 years. I was able to focus on the program and not the administration. And after I got the program under my belt, then I could learn the administration. Most people don't have that luxury. Most people start organizations and they have everything and they get overwhelmed and then they get into trouble. So I was, but I asked for help all along the way. Always looking for people that knew more than I did and figured it out. What are you doing?
I'm an MSW intern, so I'm
And you know I'm in the program, right?
Yes.
I'm an MSW student.
Oh!
I saw you during the gala dinner and I remember mentioning
Oh,
that, so,
yeah. I decided to do that because as a member of Congress, I have access to all kinds of experts, but how do you decide which expert to follow? And I decided I needed my own base of knowledge. So I'm doing the virtual program. So when I'm flying back and forth, I commute weekly. I live in DC 4 days a week, and then I'm here 3 days a week. This is our week break. So United Airlines gives me a lot of time to do homework.
I have a follow-up question about that. I spoke to Joanne Kim, and I interviewed her, and she was talking about upper management and as a woman and transitioning in life stages, going from single woman to married and having children. And how have you managed that, having such a big plate on your hands and being able to still come home to your child or be able to still do all of that?
Well, you know, at the coalition, well, I didn't run for office until my daughter was in college. And I just wouldn't have done it before, even though plenty of people did. But when I was at the coalition during the years she was growing up, the coalition was a very supportive group. Actually, Joanne and all of them were a lot younger. They didn't have kids, and so they helped me, you know, allowed to have that balance. And I've always carved out time for myself. So you asked me how do I stay sane. I swim, I bike ride. I mean, there's things I always make sure I do that. And then I always, you know, family and friends are always take precedent. So even when my daughter was growing up, she knew no matter what I was doing, she could stop me. But you have to have your priorities very clear.
Going back to anything about the MSW situation, and since you're also in the program, I'm here at the UPC in terms of the master's program. And my question was wanted to you about the push from the NASW about title protection for social workers.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with
You're not sure if you're familiar with it?
protecting the title of social worker?
Yeah, because in terms of a lot of different types of agencies hire someone who will call themselves a social worker.
Oh, I see.
With
I see.
only a few units. I
got you.
experienced that as a family member of a person with a mental health issue who just was, it was a mess. And that's why they're pushing about for title protection, also the fair pay, but I don't know where that part will work out. But the title protection aspect. So you haven't noticed, or you haven't had that come up even in your classes or anything yet?
No, I haven't. But you know, I'm pretty laser focused in the program and so that hasn't come up for me yet.
Okay.
So it's also important if you don't know something, just say you don't know.
Yeah, 'cause I know they're trying to lobby toward, trying to get that.
They're trying to get legislation passed or something?
I'm not sure if it's legislative. At some points they were talking about at least statewide or in state or such to get such as like, there's title protection for certain other things. You can't call yourself a doctor
Right.
if you're not a doctor.
Right.
Being a medical doctor as such, so that.
Yeah, you're a doctor.
I mean, that's a different referral.
I'll look out for it, but I don't know.
Okay. You spoke about issues surrounding mass incarceration as
Yes.
sort of something. What are you doing now that you're at the national level? Are there specific items that are on your agenda that you're sort of trying to get?
Yeah, two specific pieces of legislation. Well, one, I sit on another committee. I sit on Foreign Affairs, but I also sit on Judiciary. So the committee I sit on is the one that deals with immigration and other really crazy stuff. But I sit on a subcommittee called Overcriminalization. So right now I'm getting ready to introduce a piece of legislation that says, when you apply for federal student aid, there's a little box that if you ever have had a drug conviction, which to me is insane considering all the drug laws are changing. But what if you're from Colorado where marijuana is legal, you know what I mean? But yet you have an arrest from a form. So So that's one piece, to eliminate that. And then the other one is to change mandatory minimums. When I was in Sacramento, my focus was on, when we incarcerate people, but we also ban them from working once they finish their sentence. There used to be a philosophy in our society that if you committed the crime and did your time, you were accepted back into society. That is no longer the case. So there were 54 occupations that you couldn't do if you had a felony conviction, and the craziest one was you couldn't be a barber. So we actually, oh no, it's worse. It's worse. In state prison, we had programs to train you to be a barber. But then when you got out of prison, we wouldn't give you a license. So you could do construction work and have a jackhammer, but you couldn't have a pair of scissors. So we focused on that first, to use that as an educational piece, and we were able to change that. And so I went about in Sacramento trying to change the restrictions, and we were able to do that. Now, the funny thing in DC is that's becoming a very bipartisan issue. So the first thing I did with my staff member, who thought I was crazy at first, was I sent her to the Heritage Foundation. Because the Heritage Foundation, the Tea Party, Rand Paul, all of them support this. So we're trying to see, there's this really weird kind of coalition that's come together, but at the end of the day, it's about votes. So I met Rand Paul for the first time last week, because when I was on the Senate floor for Corey, I went over to introduce myself to him, because he's doing the legislation in the Senate on mandatory minimums. So those are the specific things I'm working on. There's tons of things I want to do, but I also pick pieces of legislation that are doable. I'm not into just introducing bills for message purposes.
So political feasibility is important, and
political feasibility, I mean, you know, some people like a soapbox. I just don't have time for that. So I want to do legislation that is absolutely feasible, and feasibility means, can you get the votes? It doesn't mean how great the policy is or how right it is. It means, can I get votes for this? So when I went up to Sacramento, I was naive. So I was like, well, I'm not even going to talk about the moral side of the criminal justice system. I'm going to talk to my Republican colleagues about how it costs too much money. And I was like, hey, that'll be a good point, right? And they looked at me and they said, Karen, I don't care how much it costs. So what I learned there was, where they were coming from is, if I support you in this legislation, I'm going to get hit for being soft on crime. Now, I happen to come from a very privileged situation. You know, this is my district. I'm going to represent USC. But I don't have some of the political worries that some of my other colleagues do. You know, this is a very partisan city, so it's not like I have to worry about a Republican challenger. I have to worry about a Democratic challenger, but that's a whole other, you know, ball game. So I can kind of push the envelopes in ways that some of my other colleagues can't. So part of feasibility also is building relationships with your colleagues and getting them to the point where I had some of my colleagues tell me, these were Democrats, they would tell me, you know, Karen, I hate your legislation, but I like you, so, hey. It's about relationship building, which I think is a lesson that goes in all aspects of your life.
Speaking on relationship building, I was just wondering if you find some very discrete similarities or differences in relationship building, since you've been in the state assembly and you've also been in Washington, where the state assembly, you know, there's that saying that you're only really legislate for 2 years because of the old term limits, well, which is now 12 years, versus DC, you also face different challenges because it's based on ranking, it's based on what they, there's more than 400 of them. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe the similarities or differences in the particular challenges.
Well, the thing is, well, first of all, I'm so glad that things changed in Sacramento. I would have had a whole different approach and attitude if I were there now. In DC, you know, unless I do something stupid, I have the potential to be there for a while, and so I can take a longer view of things.
Right.
Whereas in Sacramento, it was all about what I could get done in 2 years. I don't think like that now. Now, the downside of that is that I'm rather impatient. I mean, I don't like the idea. When I hear my colleagues say, well, I've been working on this bill for 10 years, I kind of go, well, no, I don't want to hear that. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
So that's kind of and then the other plus side is that I have the privilege of actually deepening my understanding and learning. Like child welfare, for example, I felt comfortable with it in LA County in California. Now there's 50 states. So I have to be really careful about what I'm doing, but I have the time to learn. And I didn't feel that in Sacramento. The other hand, building relationships in DC is harder. So this sounds really weird, but the best way we get to know each other is when we leave the country. Because we don't really interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. So when we leave the country, we're with each other for days at a time. And I have spent my first 2 years focusing on building relationships with my Republican colleagues. So I would go on trips, I'd be the only Democrat, and I'd go on trips with Republicans all over the world, and it allowed me to build relationships with a number of people. You had your hand up.
From your time in starting Community Coalition in 1989, how are the challenges different for South Los Angeles today as they were back when you started the organization?
Yeah, one fundamental difference, and then a whole lot's the same. But one fundamental difference is that there is a infrastructure that exists in South LA now that didn't exist before, and it's an infrastructure of community organizations who have a high level of sophistication in terms of impacting policy. And Community Coalition is one, there's Scope, there's just a number of organizations. A lot of them popped up after the '92 civil unrest. But, so I think that's one thing. And that the level of sophistication is to the point where they can impact public policy, they can also elect people to office. So that's why my campaigns were fun, because when I ran for the assembly, I was able to draw on, all of the years and work that I had done with people. It wasn't like I just popped up and decided I wanted to run for office. There were people that knew me for 20, 30 years that could be involved. And then, of course, what stayed the same are some of the larger structural issues in terms of unemployment, the socioeconomic conditions. But I think without that layer of infrastructure of community organizations, it would be worse. Now, on the other hand, the frustration is, I'll give you an example of a conversation I had with somebody a couple days ago who was talking about the education system. And the comment that was made to me was, well, there's nothing, this is not from a person that was from South LA. But she said, well, but there's nothing happening in terms of education reform on a grassroots basis in South LA. And I mean, it was good it was a phone conversation because I about fell out. And they were basing that on who was sitting downtown in the Board of Education. And, but in fact, there's all this work that's been going on that has made a very specific difference, and they can lay out the number of policies that they've been involved in. So the frustration is that a lot of work gets done in South LA, but no one, South LA knows about it. But, we're weird for the second largest city in the country to have sort of a newspaper. It's interesting that we don't have, more communication.
Me again. You mentioned that when you get up in the morning, you start listening to all of the different news programs. Do you or your congressman colleagues, do you have your own source of information? You would think that being in that type of position, you would have some other more pure source of information other than through the filtered source that we get through the news.
I don't believe there's pure sources of information.
Well, I mean more pure than what we get on the TV, because we know that you look at one channel, you hear a different
You
slant.
got the Democratic station and the Republican station.
You hear
Well, no, I do read multiple sources, and I have so much information, it is hard to distill. But understand that what's important is what's on the TV and in the paper, because that's what's setting right or wrong. That's what's determining what's happening. You know what I'm saying? In my day. So if I wake up tomorrow morning, like I did the other morning before the LAX thing happened, the headline was, before that breaking news, was Israel had fired on Syria. And it was interesting because that story lasted for an hour, and then the LA shooting took over. So I'm saying that, or when something happens in Syria, I know that when I go into work, that's going to be my entire day. You know what I mean? As to what that event was, you know, what has happened. So I have to know the opinion. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we actually had news. Now we have opinion. So MSNBC is the Democratic station, Fox is the Republican station, CNN is a little bit of both. But I have to know what those, you know, opinions are. I struggle sometimes with Fox, you know, because sometimes it's kind of hard to watch, but it is important to know. But one of the news shows, Morning Joe, for example, which is on at 3 o'clock here, it's on at 6 o'clock in DC. What Morning Joe does that's helpful is they go through all the opinion papers, I mean, you know, the editorials from each of the major newspapers. And so I'm watching and I'm on my computer at the same time, so that I'm reading papers and watching the news also.
I think we have time for one more question.
I defer to the dean.
Thank you very much for coming, Karen. Cherry Court, the assistant dean of the School of Social Work. I've got a question for you, because I'm very interested in this area of politics too. But being a woman of color, you know, have you encountered any specific challenges that don't allow you to perform as you would like to?
I'm not sure about the not perform as I would like to. I don't know that. But I have to deal with it every day. And I guess, you know, again, I'm used to the gender piece because that's, you know, because especially getting involved in politics at a young age during the years I did, there weren't women around. But, so it's not so much that, but it is something that I have to deal with all the time. And sometimes it's tough. I mean, sometimes I have to leave the room because it's tough to hear people say the president should go back to Kenya. Or, you know, what's his birth certificate or his college transcripts. It's like you achieve the position of the presidency and people are still questioning your qualifications. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's like, then that's when I have to go like swim. Because, you know, it's kind of important to, you know, take care of your psyche because it can definitely wear you down. I'll give you an example on the gender piece. I sit on Judish, I mentioned that. And on the Republican side, there's 23 Republicans on Judish, all men. No one, not one woman. They spent 4 hours on a hearing about abortion. And to listen to some of the things that came out of their mouth, it was like, you know, I think people need biology and physiology before they run for office, or listening to some of the immigration debates. You know, sometimes it gets to you. And I think when it does, it's important that you just kind of have to physically remove yourself, because I just refuse to be worn down by it. And if I do become worn down by it, then it's time for me to do something.
So I have one last question. I know you're good to go, but we're on a college campus. We have a lot of ambitious, young, smart people who are thinking about the policy space. What advice would you give them in pursuing a career in public policy or in politics?
Well, you know what, the thing that I always say is so important is to, you know, figure out an issue. It doesn't mean you have to pick an issue, it's going to be the issue you work on the rest of your life, but figure out a focus and really dig deep on it. And go out to whatever the focus is and learn about it from the ground. I'm amazed sometimes at how many people have studied and are experts and have not walked out that door. So you hear what they have to say and go, Jesus, I mean, you clearly have I know you're well read and you know all the research, but you don't know the issue because you haven't met any of the people involved in it. And so I think, you know, picking a focus, and then a lot of times people want to run for office and they, you know, I talk to them, and I always say, figure out what you want to accomplish. Because I've met with people who want to run for office. They say, I'm running for the state assembly, and they'll tell me all about their bio and all this other stuff. And I said, what do you want to do? And they go, oh, that's an interesting question. Because if you don't know what you want to do, and if you don't have an agenda, trust me, you will be lost. You will be consumed by everything that happens around. And then you won't really be able to make the difference that you want to. And one of the things now, having been in 2 offices, and then also having the privilege of serving as speaker, nothing that I've done, the perks and all that stuff, nothing has impressed me. You know what I mean, in terms of this is what is being in office is about. I've had people tell me they thought being in office meant you went to events and posed for pictures. So if you want to, and then intern, really take advantage of that. There's a million organizations, nonprofit organizations that are involved in every area of public policy you could imagine, domestic as well as international. Go participate in one of them. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I had the opportunity to speak to another Congress member, and when I brought up to the person why it's so complicated or so complex to get people that are doing grassroots level work to implement and advocate for the population, no matter what population it is, the person came back to me and said, I already have PhDs, which they are my superiors and my mentors as well, that are working on it. I feel that it's really, really challenging to actually go and push for that information. How do we go past that? I hear you saying, and it's music to my ears, I hear you saying that you take the grassroots level movement to implement policy. How, as a person, I want to follow policy advocacy, how do I put forth into the effort?
Well, I think, when I was describing, the education work, I think it's critical that I do it with my colleagues. So that, somebody that says something to you like that. So there's a whole bunch of people that are in office that not walk out that door either. That, create policies on stuff they are absolutely clueless about. I mean, that's happening, wait until we get back. I mean, did you have a food stamp discussion? People on food stamps, we need to make sure they have drug tests. We need to make sure they work. And it's basic ignorance. Don't you know that most people on food stamps are working? They just don't make enough money to feed themselves. Some of my colleagues are millionaires. So why would they know? But at least they should, I think, take the time to find out. So I think don't give up on that direction. But I think my obligation is to do the education work with my colleagues. And then also to identify the people who are working in the community and bring them in. One of the things I had great fun with, I mentioned the grandmothers that came up to the Capitol. I had a ball just opening up the Capitol and everybody letting them come in. One time we did this one meeting and folks in the office were like, oh, you can't, well, we wanted a room. And they said, oh, you can't have a room because it's nighttime and the security won't be there. And it's like, well, we have sessions at 2, 3 in the morning. We won't be there. That's why I told people, I said, well, I'll tell you what, let's bring 100 people in, let's see what happens. And of course we had the room and everything was fine. But I think it's really important to open up the halls of government to the masses of folks. And you can have a lot of fun with that. I hope that answered you. You're on the right track. Stay there.
And Representative Bass, you're on the right track too. So I hope you stay there for a long time, get lots done. You work on very important things. Thank you so much, Mayor.